There is a question that Nigeria's government does not want asked, not by journalists, not by activists, not by ordinary Nigerians in their millions who are struggling, grieving, displaced, and exhausted, and certainly not by a documentary camera. The question is not about Boko Haram. It is not about ISWAP. It is not about bandits in Zamfara or farmer-herder conflicts in Benue or the decades-long smoldering insurgency that has consumed the Nigerian northeast like a slow, patient fire. The question is simpler than all of that. It is this: if the Nigerian government has the capability, the digital tools, the surveillance infrastructure, the intelligence networks, the billions of naira in security budgets to locate a protester who criticized them on Twitter, track a journalist who published the wrong story, freeze the bank account of an activist within hours of a demonstration beginning, then why, in 15 years of terror, has it never been able to decisively dismantle armed groups operating from fixed locations in known forests? Sit with that question for a moment. Really sit with it. Because the answer, wherever it leads, is the real story of what is happening to Nigeria. Not the story of terrorism. Not the story of religion or ethnicity or climate. The story of power, of choice, and of a system so thoroughly entangled with the crisis it pretends to be fighting that the line between the government and the problem has become, in critical ways, impossible to see. This is the documentary, The Turn of Nigeria Insurgency, produced by Global Geopolitical Pulse, the full discussion behind it. Every claim we make is sourced. Every number is documented. Every argument is built on verified published evidence. We do not do conspiracy. We do not do speculation. We follow the evidence, we follow the logic, and we follow, most importantly, the money. Because in Nigeria today, following the money is the most dangerous thing you can do. Let us begin. The scale of the crisis, nobody seems to fix. Nigeria is many things. It is Africa's most populous nation, over 200 million people. It is a country of extraordinary cultural depth, musical genius, literary greatness, entrepreneurial fire, and human resilience that staggers the imagination. It is the birthplace of Afrobeats, Nollywood, the most vibrant tech startup scene on the continent. It is a country that, on any given morning in Lagos, crackles with the kind of energy that makes you believe anything is possible. And it is also a country that, by 2025, ranked 6th on the Global Terrorism Index, accounting for 6% of all terrorism deaths recorded globally in a single year. Source: GCRF, gcrf.org. These two Nigerias exist simultaneously. The one that creates, builds, laughs, hustles, and dreams. And the one that grieves, flees, buries its children, and wonders when or whether it will ever be safe. The crisis is not new. The Boko Haram insurgency formally began in 2009 in Maiduguri, Borno State. A militant group whose name roughly translates as Western Education is Forbidden launched what it described as a holy war to overthrow the Nigerian state and establish an Islamic caliphate across the northeast.
If there's any information, they should not hide it within themselves. They should let me know. We are here because of them. Yes, please don't hide any information away from me. Let me know.
The 15 years since, the group has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions, and evolved, splintering into factions, absorbing new ideology, and producing an offshoot called ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, that has, in many ways, surpassed its parent in organizational sophistication and operational reach. In March 2025, ISWAP launched what the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect described as a renewed offensive in Borno State, carrying out sophisticated assaults on military installations, seizing control of strategic roads and towns, and conducting what one analyst called coordinated siege warfare against the Nigerian army in its own backyard. But the Northeast is only one front. In Nigeria's northwest, across Zamfara, Katsina, Sokoto, and Kebbi states, a parallel catastrophe has unfolded. Armed groups, formerly designated as terrorists by the Nigerian government in 2021, but often still euphemistically called bandits, have turned the region into a hunting ground. In mid-2024 and mid-2025, Zamfara state alone recorded approximately 203 abductions, the highest of any state in the country. Mass kidnappings of school children, raids on farming villages, extortion of entire communities, large-scale cattle theft, all of it happening with a regularity that has ceased to shock but has never ceased to destroy. And in the Middle Belt, Nigeria's agricultural heartland, where the Sahel meets the savannah, A third crisis has been burning for years. Competition for land between predominantly Christian farming communities and predominantly Fulani Muslim herding communities, accelerated by climate change, population pressure, and decades of governance failure, has produced cycles of retaliatory violence that researchers have described as potentially amounting to crimes against humanity.
Inspecting what's left of his home after a recent attack in the Houthi community of Nigeria's Middle Belt Plateau State. Rangdong Makwang is the community's head. His house is among the many dozens that were burnt and looted when suspected headers raided the community, killing over 50 villagers.
I better die in this land because that is the oath I have taken. I will die here. Anybody that runs to another place, I know if he die, they will bring his corpse here, and it is here they will bury him. That is why I feel let my people not go anywhere.
The attack is one of several such incidents in Nigeria's Middle Belt region, which has a long history of deadly clashes between farmers and herders.
In late 2025, mass abductions escalated dramatically. In November alone, at least 402 people, mostly school children, were kidnapped across 4 north-central states in a single month, surpassing the 2014 Chibok abduction in sheer scale.
Standing in the dormitory room where his son was sleeping on Friday night when he was abducted, this father didn't want to be identified, but described what he saw.
They were being trafficked on foot the way shepherds control their herds. The gunmen were on bikes while controlling the girls.
The students aged 6 to 18 and their teachers were taken by an armed gang that stormed the Catholic St. Mary's boarding school.
I'm sad. My whole life is filled with sadness. He's my only son. He's my firstborn. Please help us.
As of April 2024, the International Organization for Migration documented over 1.3 million internally displaced persons in just the North Central and Northwest regions, up from 1.1 million in December 2023. 200,000 additional people lost their homes in 4 months. A source, IOM, cited in HRW World Report 2025, HRW.org World Report 2025 Country Chapters and Nigeria. Let that number breathe for a moment. 200,000 people in 4 months. This is not a crisis being managed. It is a crisis being inherited, passed on, and, as this documentary argues, in critical ways perpetuated. How kidnapping became Nigeria's most lucrative criminal business. April 14th, 2014. A date that should have changed everything. In the early hours of that morning, Boko Haram fighters drove into the town of Chibok, Borno State, and took 276 schoolgirls from their dormitory at the government girls' secondary school. The girls were loaded onto trucks and driven into the Sambisa forest, a dense, vast, labyrinthine wilderness that had become the insurgency's operational heartland.
Demand the return of dozens of girls abducted simply because they did.
We want these girls to be rescued with immediate effect. We want them back alive because they are tomorrow.
The world reacted with collective anguish. Let's Bring Back Our Girls became one of the most widely shared social media campaigns in history. World leaders spoke, celebrities posted. International military assistance was offered. The Nigerian government, after initially denying the abduction had even happened, eventually acknowledged it and promised swift action. 12 years later, 90 of those girls remain in captivity. 90. 12 years. Source, Human Rights Watch World Report 2025, HRW.org. But the Chibok abduction was not, as it should have been, the end of school kidnappings in Nigeria. It was the proof of concept for a business model. Since 2014, over 2,000 children have been abducted or kidnapped from Nigerian schools by Boko Haram, ISWAP, armed bandits, and various combinations of the above. In 2024 alone, at least 580 civilians, primarily women and girls, were kidnapped across multiple Nigerian states. The International Crisis Group has formally assessed kidnapping for ransom as arguably the most lucrative criminal enterprise in northwest Nigeria. Source, ICG, crisisgroup.org. Read that again. Not the most violent, not the most ideologically driven, the most lucrative. That word is doing critical work in this analysis. Because when something becomes lucrative, when it reliably generates income, when the risk to reward calculation tips in favor of the criminal, it stops being an act of desperation and becomes a rational economic strategy. It attracts investment. It builds infrastructure. It recruits labor. It creates supply chains. In short, it becomes an economy. And Nigeria's insurgency has become exactly that. A 2025 analysis by the Washington Center documented that a single kidnapping, the abduction of High Court Judge Haruna Mashelia in Borno State in September 2024, generated approximately 766 million naira in ransom payments alone. That single incident represented nearly 30% of all documented ransom payments in the country for that monitoring period. The total value of documented ransom payments more than doubled in Naira terms between 2023 and 2024, driven in part by Naira depreciation, which meant kidnappers had to demand vastly larger Naira amounts to maintain the real value of their income. In other words, as Nigeria's economy collapsed under inflation and currency devaluation, the kidnapping economy adapted, scaled, and survived. 1/3 of all documented ransom proceeds in 2024-2025 went directly to Islamist groups, including factions of Boko Haram. The ransom money funds motorcycles, weapons, ammunition, and informant networks. It pays salaries. It sustains operations. And most critically, according to the Budget Foundation's analysis of Nigeria's insecurity crisis, the success of the model has become self-replicating. When unemployed young men in the north observe that kidnapping networks generate more income than legitimate labor will ever provide, more of them join. The economy grows. The violence deepens. This is the insurgency economy, and it is operating right now inside Nigeria's broader economy, not separately. Inside it, the Naira question, where is the money? Here is where this documentary raises a point that almost nobody in Nigeria's power structure wants to confront directly. The ransom is paid in Naira, Nigerian Naira, the currency of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, a currency that, in practical terms, is only legally spendable within Nigeria. You cannot take a sack of Naira to London and use it to buy weapons from an arms dealer. You cannot pay for a cross-border operation in a currency that the receiving country has no use for. Even with currency conversion, large-scale Naira transactions through informal channels leave traces that a functional financial intelligence system should be able to follow. So, the billions of Naira that have been extracted from Nigerian families, communities, businesses, and, in some documented cases, state governments themselves over 15 years of kidnapping, must be coming back into Nigeria's economy. Not some of it. Most of it. Researchers have documented exactly how this happens. Through informal indigenous saving systems, the Esusu, the Adache, the Ajo, community-based financial networks that operate entirely outside the formal banking system, leave no digital trail, and form the economic backbone of tens of millions of Nigerians who have no bank account. Through barter trade in livestock, cattle and sheep stolen from farming communities that re-enter the market economy, through middlemen who ask no questions and record no transactions. Through cash-intensive retail trade, large informal markets across the north where cash changes hands by the hundreds of millions without a single keystroke. And through something even more concerning, the documented failure of Nigeria's anti-money laundering systems. In February 2023, Nigeria was formally placed on the Financial Action Task Force's Grey List, the international financial watchdog's formal designation for countries whose systems for preventing money laundering and terrorist financing are inadequate. Nigeria sat on that grey list for 2 years before being removed in February 2025, not because its systems had been proven effective, but because it had demonstrated procedural compliance. The structural problem, an informal economy through which terror financing can move invisibly, has not been resolved. In 2024, the value of mobile money transactions in Nigeria reached 71.5 trillion naira, a 53% increase in a single year, driven by platforms like OPay and MoneyPoint. Source: U.S. State Department, state.gov. This extraordinary growth in digital financial activity is, in many ways, a sign of economic dynamism. But it also creates an enormous and growing surface area through which illicit finance can move, especially when the regulatory infrastructure is acknowledged to be insufficient. The Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit knows this. International partners know this. The Wilson Center published a detailed analysis specifically examining how terrorist financing networks in Nigeria exploit the informal economy and recommending specific steps to disrupt them. Those recommendations have been made. That analysis has been read, and the ransom economy has continued to grow. When the government of a country knows where the problem is, has been told how to address it, has access to the tools and international support to do so, and the problem continues and worsens, the question of political will becomes unavoidable. What Nigeria spent on surveillance, and who it watched. This is the part of the story that transforms frustration into something harder and more important, a documented, verifiable pattern of institutional choice. Nigeria has not been sitting idle while its people suffer. The government has spent extraordinary sums building the capacity to protect itself. Research documented by Economy Post and Privacy International reveals that between 2013 and 2022, Nigeria spent at least $2.7 billion on surveillance technologies, tools capable of intercepting calls, reading social media messages, monitoring WhatsApp, and tracking the physical movements of individuals across a country of 200 million people. Between 2015 and 2024, Nigeria imported surveillance equipment worth $6,061 billion, with annual imports peaking at $826.8 million in 2019. In 2021, the National Assembly approved 4.86 billion naira specifically for the National Intelligence Agency.
The National Assembly has approved a 4.87 billion naira budget for the National Intelligence Agency to track, intercept and monitor calls and messages on mobile devices including Turaya and WhatsApp.
To purchase equipment to monitor Nigerians' WhatsApp messages, phone calls and text messages, broken down into 1.93 billion for a WhatsApp intercept solution and 2.93 billion for a Turaya interception solution. Source Economy Post Denji. Let those numbers settle. The Nigerian government, which has chronically underfunded schools, hospitals, rural infrastructure, and economic development programs across the north, found the money to build one of the most sophisticated civilian surveillance infrastructures in West Africa. Not to watch terrorists, to watch Nigerians. The evidence for exactly how this infrastructure is deployed came into sharp focus during the Justice and Bad Governance protests of August 2024. Those protests were born from genuine documented economic despair. By mid-2024, inflation had surged to 34.19%, a 28-year high. Food inflation exceeded 40%. The naira had lost over 40% of its value compared to the dollar. The national minimum wage had been doubled to 70,000 naira per month, but currency devaluation meant that in real terms it was below the poverty line.
On the streets of Nigeria, children roam around looking for a meal any way they can. Many of them and their parents have been displaced either by violence or poverty.
In the same year, the government unveiled a new presidential jet, a purchase that sparked nationwide outrage at a moment when ordinary Nigerians could not afford food. When Nigerians took to the streets in August 2024 under the banner of End Bad Governance, the government's response was immediate, precise, and brutal. At least 24 protesters when police opened fire. Amnesty International documented that officers fired live ammunition at close range, often at the head or torso. Over 1,000 people, including minors, were detained, with reports of arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearances, and prolonged detention without trial. Security services attacked or harassed at least 56 journalists covering the protest. 10 protesters were charged with treason, a charge that carries the death penalty in Nigeria. In November 2024, 76 more protesters, including 30 minors, were also charged with treason and inciting a coup. The Nigerian government used its intelligence infrastructure to identify protest organizers, track anonymous social media accounts, and arrest journalists for their online activity. A social commentator who ran an anonymous commentary account on X was located, detained, and held for 3 weeks without his family knowing where he was before being charged under the Cybercrimes Act. A reporter from the Foundation for Investigative Journalism disappeared in Lagos, later found in police custody, arrested for publishing a story about alleged theft from a government fund. Al Jazeera's analysis of Nigeria's Cybercrimes Act documented that Nigerian police have used journalists' call data to track and arrest them, made possible by provisions of the law that do not require a court-issued warrant before accessing subscriber information from service providers. Freedom House's 2025 assessment confirmed the broader pattern. Authorities continue to crack down on protesters, online activists, and journalists who publish content that negatively portrays those in power, while crimes committed against journalists continue to go unpunished, even when the perpetrators are known. And here is where the argument of this documentary reaches its most uncomfortable point. The Nigerian government has demonstrated, in documented, verifiable, publicly reported detail, that it possesses the surveillance capability to identify anonymous social media accounts, track individuals through their phone data, intercept WhatsApp communications, locate and arrest critics within days of a public statement, coordinate simultaneous crackdowns across multiple states, and it has deployed all of these capabilities aggressively, repeatedly, and with impunity against its own citizens who dared to criticize it. Meanwhile, Boko Haram and ISWAP have been operating from the Sambisa forest and surrounding terrain for 15 years. Armed bandits have been raiding villages, running kidnapping operations, and building hybrid criminal economies across the northwest also for years. Their locations are not unknown. Their operational patterns are documented by international researchers, some of whom work with open-source satellite imagery that is publicly available online. Freedom House's 2024 assessment noted that the Nigerian government has accused journalists of undermining national security when reporting on military operations, while the military's own social media strategy during crises has been documented as prioritizing image management over accountability. A state that can silence critics faster than it stops killers has made a statement, whether it intends to or not, about who it considers the real threat, why this crisis has lasted as long as it has. The word complicity is uncomfortable. It is meant to be, because it does not allow us to point only at the obvious villains and call the analysis complete. Complicity is structural. It is systemic, and in Nigeria's insurgency, it operates on three distinct interlocking levels, each of which must be named if the crisis is to be honestly understood. Layer 1, the political class. The most direct layer of complicity is the easiest to name and the hardest to prosecute. Nigeria's political class has, across multiple administrations, treated the insurgency not as a national emergency demanding sacrifice and structural change, but as a management problem, something to be contained, reported on, budgeted for, and eventually explained away in press conferences that nobody believes. The Accord Research Institute has documented that Nigeria's counterterrorism strategy has consistently focused on the symptoms of insecurity: military operations, targeted arrests, border management, while systematically avoiding its structural causes: poverty, youth unemployment, ungoverned spaces, marginalization of northern communities, and a political system that rewards ethnic and religious division while punishing national unity. So, these causes are not mysterious. They have been documented, published, and presented to the Nigerian government by its own researchers, by international bodies, by civil society organizations, and by the communities bearing the consequences. The GCRF has noted that since 2007, Nigeria has seen over 11,000 people killed in insurgency-related violence, with the Northeast and Northwest accounting for the overwhelming majority. In 2024, Nigeria's economy dropped from Africa's second to fourth largest by GDP, a staggering fall for a country with its resources, talent pool, and economic potential. The IMF recorded annual average inflation surging to 31% in 2024, driven by naira depreciation, food supply deficits, energy subsidy removal, and high borrowing costs. By the World Bank's assessment, Nigeria had the world's second largest poor population after India, with 104 million people living below the poverty line. Source: U.S. State Department, state.gov. These numbers are not incidental to the insurgency. They are the insurgency's oxygen supply. An exhaustive body of research has established that poverty, youth unemployment, and the absence of economic alternatives are the primary drivers of recruitment into both terrorist organizations and criminal kidnapping networks in Nigeria's north. When there is no school, no job, no future, and someone offers you a motorcycle, a weapon, and a share of the ransom, the calculation for a desperate young man is not as simple as those in Abuja would like to believe. And yet, in 2024, the Nigerian government unveiled a new presidential jet. And when the people who cannot feed their children protested, they were charged with treason. This is not governance failure by accident. It is governance failure by priority. Layer 2, the ransom trap. The second layer of complicity is the most painful to discuss because it involves people who have no good choices making the only choice available to them, and in doing so, feeding the machine that will destroy someone else's family next. When your child is taken, what do? You pay. Not because you are weak, not because you are complicit in any moral sense, but because the state has abdicated its responsibility to protect you. No credible rescue infrastructure exists, and the only way to get your child back alive is to give armed criminals what they are asking for. In 2024, the Nigerian government unveiled a new presidential jet, and when the people who cannot feed their children protested, they were charged with treason. This is not governance failure by accident. It is governance failure by priority. Layer 2, the ransom trap. The second layer of complicity is the most painful to discuss because it involves people who have no good choices, making the only choice available to them, and in doing so, feeding the machine that will destroy someone else's family next. When your child is taken, what do? You pay. Not because you are weak, not because you are complicit in any moral sense, but because the state has abdicated its responsibility to protect you. No credible rescue infrastructure exists, and the only way to get your child back alive is to give armed criminals what they are asking for. No individual family can be blamed for this. But the system that forces families into this impossible position and then does nothing to interrupt the financial cycle that it creates bears responsibility that is both political and moral. The International Crisis Group has specifically documented what it calls the ransom trap, the dynamic by which individual families, acting rationally in an individual crisis, collectively fund the system that makes the next crisis inevitable. Source: ICG, crisisgroup.org. When the state refuses to build a credible alternative, real rescue operations, real intelligence, real consequences for kidnappers, ransom becomes the only exit from an impossible situation. And as the Washington Center's 2025 analysis documented, the kidnappers have adapted to Nigeria's economic crisis with chilling rationality. As the naira depreciated and lost value, armed groups simply increased their naira demands to maintain the real purchasing power of their ransom income. The insurgency economy is not static. It is dynamic, adaptive, and growing. In 2025, the Nigerian parliament moved to classify kidnapping as a terrorism offense and apply the death penalty to perpetrators and funders. President Tinubu has pledged to modernize security systems and break the financial chain of kidnapping networks. Civil society organizations have responded cautiously, noting that without real improvements in investigative capability, financial tracing, and prosecution, legal reform will remain an empty gesture. They are right to be cautious. Because the question is not whether Nigeria has good laws. Nigeria has many good laws. The question is whether those laws are enforced and against whom. Layer 3, the silence that protects everything. The third and final layer of complicity is the one that makes all the others sustainable: enforced silence. Reporters Without Borders ranks Nigeria as one of the most dangerous countries for journalists in West Africa. During the August 2024 protests, approximately 30 journalists were assaulted, arrested, or targeted with tear gas and gunfire while doing their jobs. The Committee to Protect Journalists documented more than 50 journalists assaulted or harassed by security forces during the same period. Crimes committed against journalists in Nigeria continue to go unpunished. Even RSF notes when the perpetrators are known or have been apprehended. The Freedom House 2024 assessment of internet freedom in Nigeria documented that the persistent threat of legal prosecution and extra-legal retaliation has produced growing self-censorship among Nigerian journalists, particularly among those who publish online, where the Cyber Crimes Act gives security agencies broad, warrantless access to their communications. This is the ultimate function of the surveillance state, not to catch every critic, but to make every potential critic afraid. Self-censorship is cheaper than mass imprisonment and more effective than any gag order. When journalists cannot safely report on the links between the insurgency economy and the legitimate economy, those links remain invisible. When activists cannot safely organize around the question of where the ransom money goes, that question goes unanswered. When communities cannot safely demand accountability from their security forces without risking treason charges, accountability never comes. The silence does not just protect the powerful from criticism, it protects the system from reform. Why Nigeria cannot solve this alone, but must lead. No country in West Africa suffers in isolation. The Sahel, the vast dry band of territory stretching across the continent south of the Sahara, has been in slow-motion collapse for years. In Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, military coups between 2021 and 2023 toppled civilian governments that, for all their flaws, had been partners in regional counterterrorism cooperation. The juntas that replaced them expelled French and American military forces, withdrew from the G5 Sahel cooperation framework, and, in some cases, reached accommodations with the very armed groups they were supposed to be fighting. The consequences for Nigeria have been direct. ISWAP and Boko Haram have cross-border networks, fighters, weapons, money, and ideology moving across frontiers that no single government fully controls. As operational pressure increased in some neighboring countries, those networks adapted by increasing activity in Nigeria. Nigeria's Counter-Terrorism Director General's end-of-year briefing in December 2025 specifically noted this regional dimension, describing how instability across the Sahel had created new operational space for terrorist networks in Nigeria's north. In December 2025, the United States military launched airstrikes against alleged Islamic State-linked targets in northwestern Sokoto state, a significant escalation of American involvement in Nigeria's insurgency, reportedly intended to curb mass abductions and bandit activity. The strikes did not end the attacks. By late January 2026, over 160 worshippers had been abducted in a single incident, and in February, an armed group attacked 2 villages in Kwara State, killing over 160 people and abducting dozens more. This regional dimension is real, important, and cannot be wished away. Nigeria faces external pressures that are genuine and that no domestic policy alone can resolve. But here is the critical distinction that this documentary insists on making. The existence of external pressure does not absolve internal failure. A Nigeria with strong governance, a functional economy, an engaged and protected northern population, and a security apparatus genuinely oriented toward protecting citizens rather than protecting power would be significantly harder for any regional terrorist network to exploit. The domestic failure creates the vulnerability. The regional instability exploits it. Fixing the regional problem while the domestic failure persists is like patching a hole in a ship while the hull continues to rot. The Nigeria that does not appear in government press releases. Behind every statistic in this documentary, every number, every percentage, every index ranking is a person. A mother who has been waiting 12 years for a daughter who has not come home. A farmer who paid everything he had, borrowed what he didn't have, and still came back from the negotiation with 1 child instead of 3. A young man in Kano who has the grades, the creativity, and the burning ambition to build something, but who cannot focus on building because he is spending his energy being afraid. A journalist who deleted her investigation before it was published because she knows what happens to journalists who publish the wrong things about the wrong people. A protester, now charged with treason, who took to the street because he could not feed his children. An elderly woman in Maiduguri who has buried 2 sons and who asks quietly and without theatrics when it will end, and who will end it. The Budget Foundation's analysis of Nigeria's insecurity describes something that the numbers only partially capture: the economy of fear. When businesses close and relocate to other African countries because they cannot guarantee the safety of their employees and assets, those are not just economic statistics. They are the futures of Nigerian workers that will never be built. When children stop going to school because their parents are afraid, those are not just enrollment numbers. They are lifetimes of potential that Nigeria will never recover. When communities abandon farmland because armed groups have occupied it, those are not just agricultural statistics. They are the foundations of food security being eroded in a country already struggling with 40% food inflation. Nigeria's poverty rate grew from 44% in 2021 to 46% in 2023, and credible projections suggest it has continued rising. Over 13 persons were abducted every single day in Nigeria in the first half of 2021 alone, translating to 2,371 individuals in 6 months. The number has not decreased. Ordinary Nigerians, stressed, grieving, displaced, and exhausted, understand the situation with a clarity that much of their political class has chosen not to share. They are not confused about what is happening. They are not misled by false narratives or distracted by foreign interference. They see with the brutal clarity of people who live inside the consequences exactly what their government is prioritizing and exactly what it is not. That clarity is not despair. It is the beginning of something, and why it must begin now. The title of this documentary is The Turn of Nigeria Insurgency. Not the end, not the solution, the turn. Because what is needed first, before any policy reform, before any security operation, before any investment in governance or development, is a fundamental shift in the direction of political will. A turn. A reorientation of the state toward the people it is supposed to serve, rather than toward the protection of the system that serves those at the top. The turn will not come from a single election. though elections matter. Nigeria approaches future political cycles with questions of fairness, inclusion, and leadership at their center. And those questions have real consequences for whether the state begins to function in the interests of ordinary Nigerians. The turn will not come from a single military operation, though operational effectiveness matters. Nigeria's security forces need resources, training, better equipment, and, crucially, a command structure oriented toward protecting civilians rather than protecting the system. The turn will not come from international pressure alone, though international accountability matters. The U.S. State Department, the International Crisis Group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and dozens of other bodies have documented Nigeria's failures in exhaustive detail. That documentation has value. But documentation alone does not move governments that are not afraid of being documented. The turn can only come when three things happen simultaneously. First, when the question of where the ransom money goes is asked loudly, publicly, persistently, and by enough people that it cannot be dismissed, deflected, or buried. The financial intelligence infrastructure exists to begin answering this question. The political will to deploy it has been absent. Building popular demand for that answer among Nigerian civil society, among the international community, among investors and trade partners who depend on Nigerian stability is the foundation of everything else. Second, when the selective deployment of state power towards citizens and away from armed groups is recognized not as a governance failure but as a political choice and held to the standard of political accountability. The evidence documented in this film, $6.61 billion in surveillance equipment, WhatsApp interception solutions, journalists tracked through their call data, protesters charged with treason, is not the evidence of a government that cannot protect its people. It is the evidence of a government that has chosen what to protect. Third, when Nigerians themselves, in their hundreds of millions, refuse to accept the explanation that this is simply how things are. The Bring Back Our Girls movement showed what Nigerian civil society can do when it decides a crime is too large to ignore. The NSARS movement showed what young Nigerians are capable of when they believe their voice matters. The End Bad Governance protests, met with bullets and treason charges, showed what the government is afraid of when enough people stand together. Fear is information. When a government charges protesters with treason for holding signs and chanting slogans, it is telling you exactly how much power it believes those protesters have. The insurgency in Nigeria is 15 years old. It has consumed tens of thousands of lives. It has displaced millions. It has extracted billions of naira from the most vulnerable communities in one of Africa's most resource-rich nations and pumped that money into an economy of violence that feeds on poverty, despair, and the absence of legitimate alternatives. And throughout all of it, the government has demonstrated repeatedly and verifiably that it has the capability to act decisively when it chooses to. The turn is a choice. And it belongs ultimately not to the government, but to the Nigerian people who have the right to demand it, the evidence to justify it, and in their extraordinary resilience and collective intelligence, every capacity to achieve it. And perception can be changed. We close this documentary with the same principle that runs through every part of it. In today's world, power is not only about what happens. It is about what is known, what is said, and what is demanded. The story of Nigeria's insurgency has, for too long, been told in fragments. In body counts, in aid appeals, in counterterrorism briefings, in the language of security and threat management. This documentary has tried to tell it differently, to follow the money, to name the choices behind the failures, to hold the contradiction of a government that can find a journalist but cannot find a terrorist up to the light and ask what it means. The answer to that question determines everything. Because a government that cannot find terrorists is a government with a capacity problem, which can be solved with resources and reform. But a government that will not find terrorists because finding them would disrupt a political economy that benefits those at the top is a government with a legitimacy problem. And legitimacy problems are not solved with more surveillance equipment. They are solved eventually and inevitably by the people. Nigeria is not lost. The country that has produced Wole Soyinka and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Fela Kuti and Burna Boy and the most dynamic startup ecosystem in Africa, that Nigeria is not finished. The woman studying by herself on the school steps in our opening scene is not finished. The man who paid ransom and got 2 of his 3 children back and still got up the next morning, he is not finished. Nigeria is waiting for its turn. And the turn begins when enough people inside Nigeria and watching from outside it, decide that the truth is more powerful than the silence surrounding it. You just watch the truth, not the press release version, not the government's version. The documented, sourced, verified truth about what is really happening in Nigeria. If this moved you, do something about it. Subscribe to Global Geopolitical Pulse, like this documentary. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you are Nigerian, especially if you have lived this. Hit the bell so you never miss our next investigation. And share this film with anyone who is still asking why, after 15 years, nothing has changed. The stories that matter most are the ones told least. We are Global Geopolitical Pulse, and we will keep telling them. The turn begins here.